Please join me in welcoming Jill Dougherty.
I'll get my water supply and also my watch, because we've decided it's really great to be here. And I'm going to be guided by this because we really want to have some questions. And I know Margot's all set. We're going to sit down here in about a half an hour. I thought I'd talk for about a half an hour. And I have to say, I was sitting here and I saw Hubert Humphrey's picture over there and thought of him back in the old Soviet Union. I was an exchange student at Leningrad State University in, I hate to say, 1969 and 1970, and Hubert Humphrey visited our dorm. And I remember him walking, and I have a picture of him walking into our ramshackle dorm, which was from the early 1800s. And it brought back a lot of memories. It brought back a lot of good memories because I had a wonderful time. You know, I just turned 20, and as part of this exchange that was funded and organized by the State Department at the time, with a consortium of U.S. universities. And it was a real exchange, except the Russians didn't come over to us. We went to them. A lot of times they could not trust their own people to get out of the country. And how it's changed, and yet how it hasn't changed. And I think that's what I want to talk about tonight. I want to take you back. You know, I actually did write something. You'd be glad to know. But I also began to think that what I should really do is be very up to the minute. And as we know, up to the minute means this election. It means what President Putin is doing literally like today and yesterday and a couple of days ago. It means really breaking news, as we put it. So I thought I'd kind of begin with some of that and then step back. And this may be kind of writing my book in my head, but I'd like to try to explain perhaps where Putin is coming from, why Russians do what they do, and why Putin is doing what he's doing right now. Probably very presumptuous of me. And then try to put it in some type of cohesive understanding. It's very difficult because, you know, I really do believe that people and countries have almost like a movie going on in their minds at all times. And it tells them, that movie tells them their history of where they came from. It gives them an idea of what their role in the world is. And people try to explain, as Americans, we do that. You know, who are we as a people? What's our role in the world? And how should we be interacting with other countries? What are our guiding principles? There are a lot of different questions. Russia, I think, and I'll get into this a little more specifically, but I think that Russia, to understand modern Russia, which is exactly 25 years old this year in December, that's the end of the Soviet Union, happened in December 25 years ago, 1991. And I don't think that the Russians have really come to a good definition of who they are in the world. I think they're trying to do that. I think that's part of the role that Putin has taken upon himself to define who they are. But let's begin with some breaking news. Just in the past few days, you know that there was a ceasefire that fell apart in Syria. John Kerry and Minister Lavrov, the foreign minister, had been working very hard to try to get this ceasefire. It fell apart, and then all of a sudden, I think the United States felt that it had been led along by the nose by the Russians for quite a long time, and a truly acrimonious period broke out. And it's shocking, just in the last week, think about it, President Putin said he was halting an agreement on disposing of plutonium, which is, you know, a part of the fuel for nuclear weapons. He put anti-aircraft missiles in Syria. He sent more missiles to Kaliningrad, which is that Russian enclave near Poland, all the way into Europe. He said, by the way, I may reopen bases in Cuba and Vietnam, all in just a few days. So we are back to something that some are calling the new Cold War. And I do think that that really is apt terminology. I can tell you, I go to Russia quite a lot. I was there just a couple of months ago, maybe going back by the end of the year. And there is, and I'm sorry to say, but there is really a feeling of almost war fever. Just recently this week, Russians carried out an exercise in which civilians, emergency crews, etc., simulated what they would do in some type of a major emergency. And it really was almost a wartime scenario. As I was in Moscow, as I said a couple of months ago, the feeling was very much among the people that I talked to that war was about to break out, and that would be war with the United States. I had a taxi driver say, when is the war going to begin? And I looked at him and I said, wait a minute, war? Are you actually talking about war? And he said, yes, we're all very frightened that there's going to be war between the United States and Russia. And I had to tell him, nobody wants war, but he was very frightened. I talked to a producer who was with CNN, who comes from kind of a working class, young guy, kind of a working class neighborhood. And I said to him, Arkady, what's happening in your neighborhood? What's the scuttlebutt? What are people talking about in terms of relations with the United States? And do you know what he said? He said, well, my neighbors are buying matches, salt, and kasha. And kasha is like a grain. And matches, salt, and kasha are what Russians did during World War II to be prepared for any eventuality. So this is not a joke. You hear more open talk of Russia's military and nuclear prowess. There's more saber rattling. And there really is this feeling that that Russia is ready to respond militarily to the United States. So how did we get here? Okay, so that's where I'd like to kind of go back to that period at the end of the Soviet Union, the beginning of modern Russia. 1991, I mentioned December 31st, or actually Christmas Day, 1991. I was working at the White House. I covered the White House for about, I guess, 6 years. And I was new, low man on the totem pole, so I had to work Christmas. And I was at the White House, and I thought, oh, nothing's going to happen. This is going to be so boring. And then all of a sudden, the Soviet Union collapsed. I mean, it was like all of a sudden the news flash, Soviet Union is being dissolved. The flag, if you remember, some of you may remember, the Soviet flag at the corners of the Kremlin was lowered, and the modern Russian flag was raised. I stood there on the lawn, and I thought, this country that I have been interested in since I was 13 years old, when I started studying the Russian language, doesn't exist anymore. And I had real trouble even grasping that, as I know some people in the State Department and the White House and everybody else, the Pentagon, had difficulty wrapping their heads around that too. But all of a sudden it was over. But I really would make the argument that the Soviet Union really did not dissolve. And this is one of the problems that I think plagues the relationship. There is very much a feeling in the West, certainly in the United States, that it was almost kind of like ding dong, the witch is dead. That the Soviet Union's over, they will come and be part of the West. Communism is dead as well, or at least communist control, and we can work with them. There was a bit of kind of triumphalism, which galled Vladimir Putin at that point. But it was too early to really think about that. But certainly everyone kind of felt we don't have to worry about communism anymore because, after all, it's over. But that way of life, which had existed for 70 years, did not magically disappear. And I think the mentality of Russians, knowing that they were a superpower, and then all of a sudden they were not, is something that they have been trying to emotionally, mentally, and every other way grapple with. And it has created a giant chip on the shoulder of many Russians. And oddly enough, not just people who lived through the Soviet Union, remember the days when Russia really saved the West from Hitler, not just those people. There are young people today who miss the fact that they are a superpower. There is a poll that I looked at not too long ago that shows that if you look at support for Putin, and remember, the polls, I would take off a certain percentage, maybe 10, 20 points, but Putin's a very popular man in Russia. His ratings are somewhere around 82, 85%. It's incredible. And yet, why is he so popular? That I think Russians, many people in the older generation, remember the good old days and want them to come back. The middle generation, let's say in their 40s and 50s, are split. Some support Putin and like him because he's not drunk the way President Yeltsin was. They're proud of that. But the people who are some of the strongest supporters of Putin and this kind of this resurgent Russia are young people. And I mean teenagers and 20-year-olds. Now, why would that be? Because it seems counterintuitive that, your communism is over, they can travel wherever they want, they can listen to any music that they want, they're on the internet just as our young people are. Why would it be that way? But you look statistically, and they are big. I'm saying as a group. This is not everyone. But large numbers of them are very supportive of President Putin. And I think that it is pride that Russia is back on the world stage. It is throwing its weight around, sometimes to its own detriment. But they feel that Russia matters. And Russia matters maybe, in our understanding, for the wrong things. But Russia does matter. In fact, look at what President Putin said the other day. When this news of Russian hacking came out, he said, well, and this is kind of a dig to President Obama. He said, they were kind of talking about us as a regional power, but it's nice to know that we're the center of the American election campaign. I'm paraphrasing, but very close. And he said, it's very flattering to know that we matter. So he's sticking it to Obama, who did say that they were kind of a regional power and didn't really matter that much. Now, they matter in, I think, many negative ways, but kind of as, well, shall I say the word Donald Trump now? But I will say it once. I say, Donald Trump has said, it doesn't really matter what they say about you as long as they're talking about you. And it's kind of the same mentality that, Russia thinks, listen, as one Russian said to me, they may not love us, but they fear us. And that's a compliment in Russia. So the world fears them. The United States, to a certain extent, is concerned about what they will do. The Baltic countries fear them. There are a lot of people who wonder whether, Russia is going to be on their doorstep. So Russia matters right now. And I think that is a point of pride among a lot of Russians that they're back on the world stage. I could have sworn that I saw Vladimir Putin out at one of the polling stations around here, but I may be wrong. Is it? Carol, did you see that? Or no? Oh, okay. All right. So, not yet, but maybe. And we do have that hacking. So what happens, if you look at the early stages of modern Russia, Russia was a mess. It was very weak. President Yeltsin had said to the different regions of Russia, take as much power as you want. And things were rather chaotic. Power was dispersed in a very broad way. The media were, some of them were kind of bought and sold by oligarchs, but it was pretty much a rough and tumble free media world. Economically, they were kind of a mess. It was a very difficult time, but there were plenty of people there from the West who were giving them advice on what they should do. Russians feel that it was chaotic. The West was kind of happy that the communists weren't in power. And when Vladimir Putin came in, he looked at this, and the biggest danger during Yeltsin's days was really that the country would fall apart or maybe even dissolve into a civil war. And maybe, don't forget, nuclear weapons were dispersed. There were 3 countries that were part of the Soviet Union, including Ukraine, that had nuclear weapons. And thank God, the Nunn-Lugar program, which brought those nuclear weapons back to Moscow and out of the regions, out of Ukraine. Ukraine would be a very different situation today if they had nuclear weapons. Think about it. So Putin comes in and he sees chaos, and as a former KGB agent, he had been through periods of chaos before. His station was in Dresden, Germany, during the Cold War. He had seen the fall of the wall, the Berlin Wall, in which the famous story where he was at the Russian consulate, or I guess it was an embassy at that consulate, I guess, and he picked up the phone as crowds were gathering outside. German crowds were gathering outside the Russian embassy, and they weren't friendly. He picked up the phone to Moscow, and as he relates in his autobiographical book written by others, he said, no, I mean that. That's not fair. It was a book written by journalists in which they interviewed him. I'm not saying that he didn't write his own book. He could have written his own book. But it was a book that introduced him on a very personal way to Russians in his early stages. So he said he picked up the phone to Moscow, and Moscow didn't answer in 1989. So that was chaos point number 1. Then he goes back, the wall falls, then the Soviet Union falls apart. And that's another period where he had been in Germany. He wasn't in Moscow during the ferment of that changeover to the end of Gorbachev and the beginning of Yeltsin and the democratic ferment, albeit chaotic. He wasn't part of that. So he gets back to St. Petersburg, Leningrad, and then St. Petersburg, and he sees more chaos that he's not used to. So that's chaotic point number 2. And he vowed that that would not happen again. And another factor, I think, in the Psychology 101 of Vladimir Putin is that he comes from Leningrad. And, I mentioned I was an exchange student, so I spent first a summer, as I know Margot was an exchange student, and probably there are some other people who were as well. And, Leningrad was a very difficult place in 1969 and 1970. It was dark. It felt like World War II had just ended. We had regular outages of hot water. The fuel would, at that point, gas and oil, there were certain problems with that. We didn't have hot water in our dormitory. And so I used to have to go to the banya. And the banya is a bathhouse. And there I would see these women, who had actually, at that point, gone through World War II, gone through the blockade of Leningrad by the Nazis, and had really literally starved. People died. In fact, in President Putin's own family, his mother almost died of starvation. I believe the story because it's just so typical of what happened. She was almost hauled off to a common grave, to a cemetery, but they discovered at the last minute she was still breathing because she collapsed from hunger. His father went to the front, shot up unmercifully, came back, was in a hospital and then was sent back to the front again. And his little brother, what would have been his older brother, Putin was born after the war in 1952, but what would have been his older brother died, they think, of dysentery when he was, I believe, 3, maybe 2 or 3. And until very recently, they did not even know where his little body was buried. His body ended up in a common grave along with thousands of other Russians in a cemetery that's called Piskaryovskaya Cemetery. So President Putin, whether, people like him or not, has a lot of personal history of Russia falling apart, vulnerable, attacked, and insulted, he would say, by the West. So my Psychology 101 is that Vladimir Putin has decided that this is not going to happen on his watch. And he is bound and determined to put Russia back on the international stage. He is bound and determined to do everything that he possibly can to parlay whatever power they have to make Russia a key player. Witness what's happening in Syria, and I'm sure there'll be some questions on that. But, part of that obviously was to rescue President Assad of Syria, but it was also to make sure that Russia is a factor in whatever the ultimate solution for that conflict will be. And he's done that, you could argue, quite skillfully in Syria. He has injected himself around the world. He is now very much a player in the Middle East. He has this would be, I think, a malevolent side of his foreign policy, but he has created these, conflicts in different countries in the perimeter, which are unresolved conflicts, in which he can continue to keep countries in the neighborhood relatively weak. Witness Georgia. I know some people you came back from Georgia. Witness Ukraine with Crimea, which is now part of Russia. He's played his cards pretty well. So how did he do it? And here I'll do a little skip and a jump. Maybe, Carol, you can keep me honest on the time. So maybe another 10, 15 minutes, something like that, and then we'll get to questions. But so how did he do it? One of the first things he did was to control the media, because he knew, as a former KGB person who understands that in Russia, the media are very important. Saturation of television, even in the, most, I was going to say, deaf. The Russians call them deaf places, these towns in the hinterland that are very, very primitive. This penetration of TV is in the 90s, 95%, 92, 95%. A lot of people watch TV. So controlling the media was very important. How did he do it? Primarily, there were cases, in fact, I witnessed them myself, where you had guys with guns at the door for one of the stations called NTV. But a lot of it was financial control, allowing people who were close to the Kremlin to buy up broadcasting stations. It could mainly television, some radio. And then they were friendly to the Kremlin. And they were all of a sudden part of this system of state-owned TV. Some are owned outright by the state, but a lot of others are simply cozy relationships with people who are close to Putin or close to the power structure. So that was one thing that he did. Then I think after controlling the media, and I should say there are a few outlets that are still pretty, you could call them opposition, but they have really been marginalized. And the people who work for them, I consider some of the bravest journalists in the world, because they know that if they get on the wrong side of somebody, they can be murdered. And you remember Anna Politkovskaya, who reported on Chechnya, the war in Chechnya, who was gunned down in the entrance to her building. I knew her, and I was covering Russia at that time, the bureau chief. And these things definitely happened and can happen today. So you control the media. Then you try to put together, and this is where it gets, I think, very interesting, a national idea of what Russia is. Now, the American idea would be democracy, freedom, democracy, human rights, First Amendment rights, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. You too can be a business person and be successful, and immigrants are welcome, and we can all do it together. We have, since like I grew up in the 1950s with that, very specific understanding of what America's all about. Russia, just as President Putin, could not really come to terms with what it was all about when the Soviet Union ended. In fact, they had a commission. They actually had a commission that was put together by President Yeltsin to develop a national idea, nationalna idea. So this commission met for about a year. It was kind of the graybeards, the thinkers, the intellectuals. They got together, and a year later, they disbanded and threw up their hands and said, we don't know. We cannot come up with a national idea. So Putin has slowly but surely put together this parts of this national idea. And he took a little bit of Tsarism, the old Tsars, which is Mother Russia, empire, proud, intellectual history, culture, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, the ballet, all of this stuff, which Russia is incredible. The level of culture, high culture in Russia, is extraordinarily high. So he takes part of Tsarism, he takes some of the Soviet Union, and primarily he takes the Great War for the Fatherland, better known to us as World War II, and the bravery that the Russians showed, which they really did. We all know what they did during World War II. So World War II right now, when you're in Moscow, you would swear, again, it happened yesterday. Even for people who, 50 years ago, these kids are walking around, and it feels like just yesterday that World War II is over. Enormous pride, and it is pumped up by the national media and used as a unifying factor today. He also used religion, the Russian Orthodox Church, which is very politically connected to the power structure and has interesting influence in a lot of different places. Part of the reason that they have a role in Syria was that they support the Christians in Syria, many of whom are Orthodox Christians. There's a big role that the Russian Orthodox Church plays in the Syria connection. Then they also took modern day. Now, the modern day is where I have trouble because what they say is we are also a modern country. We are technologically sophisticated. And I think this is where it kind of falls apart because Putin's dilemma, and he is a very intelligent man, he knows that they have existed now for 25 years on oil and gas. And that's how they made their money. And that is why their economy has severe problems. The military, I was looking at some statistics today, he's poured a lot of money into the military, but they are facing 6% cuts every year in the military, which is sacred, for the next 3 years. Every year, 6% cut in the military budget, which is almost unheard of. So their economy is not doing well, and it's because of oil and gas and living the good life until prices plummeted in half, essentially, from what they used to be. So he would like to have a technologically sophisticated country, but in order to do that, he has to open up politically and allow people to do unpredictable things, like become entrepreneurs. Some of us were talking about that today. He has to allow a Silicon Valley mentality, which is very disruptive, and disruptive in the good and bad sense of that term. That's something that President Putin has real difficulty doing. So I think he has a dilemma, because he can't open his economy the way it should be opened, but he has to open it if he wants to compete internationally. And then finally, I would say the last part of the equation, that emotional equation, who are we as a people, is a sense of grievance. And this is where we get into very dangerous territory. Russians have a chip on their shoulders. They feel that at the end of the Cold War, that the West rubbed their noses in the fact that the West had so-called won, that they ignored Russia's interests or views on anything. Triumphalism reigned in the West, and Russia meant nothing. And you could make that argument. I think actually part of that really is true. So Putin has taken that to feel that he is tried. He would make the argument, look, after 9/11, I'm the first international leader who called Bush to offer support. And that is true. He was the very first person who called Bush. And he opened the northern passageway so that planes could go into Afghanistan to the United States and to NATO, which was really very surprising. And he feels that he got nothing in return. He feels that he got color revolutions, the so-called color revolutions. In Ukraine, the Orange Revolution. In Georgia, the Rose Revolution. He would even argue that Arab Spring was something that the United States instigated. And he has a personal animosity toward Hillary Clinton because of the demonstrations on the streets of Moscow in 2012 by people over their own demonstrations against the elections. And he blames Hillary Clinton for, quote, giving the sign to those Russian demonstrators to go out in the streets and protest. He literally thinks that the United States is trying to carry out a color revolution against him and depose him. So to him, this is personal. He believes that we're trying to carry out regime change in Russia. Now, if I asked you, you would probably say, no, I don't think that's what the US is trying to do, but he does. So maybe I will begin to kind of wrap up here because I know there are so many questions, but I'll leave you with this thought. You know, I follow media and propaganda a lot. It's something that I'm very, very interested in. And I wrote a thesis, actually, for my master's about this, which was, at that point, let's say 8 years ago, Russia, I kind of thought, was beginning to get its national idea together. And it was beginning to reconstitute the outlets for media, strategy, propaganda, public diplomacy, everything that they had under the Soviets. They were beginning to rebuild it. And at that point, you could almost, I mean, I was kind of lulled into thinking that Russia would get its act together, have an idea about itself, and begin to really go out there and proudly tell the world what Russia has to offer. But it didn't happen that way. What Russia now does in its propaganda, both domestically for its own people, in the neighborhood, which would be former Soviet republics, now independent countries, and internationally, is it does not say, here we are, Russia has some of the answers. You know, the way the US says, well, we have democracy, and democracy is a human value that you can ascribe to around the world. Russia doesn't have a prescription, a Russian prescription for the world. But what it does have, it has the ability to criticize the West. And it has the ability to undermine citizens in the West and their faith in democracy and liberal democracy and how it works. And right now, you can see it happening in the United States with this election, with criticism coming from Donald Trump, who says that it's all rigged. You know, the Russians are parroting that back. They don't have to make up any propaganda. All they have to do is quote what's being said. And in Europe, they can say, look at Europe. Look at Europe. They say they're democratic, but then they turn away those migrants, you know? So they can begin to say, and look at the disruption. Europe is chaotic. Europe's falling apart. Europe is collapsing because it's corrupt, morally corrupt. Russia, of course, right now says that it's the moral force in the world. This really is part, I should have mentioned that, in connection with the church, etc. Russia literally believes that it is a moral compass in the world that is debauched, especially in Europe and the United States, with gay marriage, crazy, you know, everything that goes on in our society, that we're falling apart morally, and they are the moral force in the world. So I guess what I would say is, if you look at how Russia now exploits its power, it's a spoiler. Russia is a spoiler. I say this with all the love in my heart for Russia, which could be better. But right now, it's playing the role of spoiler. And that can be very effective because the West does have problems. There is a crisis in how liberal democracy can provide what the people actually need, jobs, education, etc. It's fueling the election debates that we have in the United States, and it's certainly fueling what's going on in Europe. And I think it is going to be one of the biggest things beyond all sorts of ideologies and all sorts of Republicans and Democrats. You ain't seen nothing yet. When you think what artificial intelligence and robotics will mean to our societies very soon, there will be fewer jobs. There will be more societal chaos. There will be more need to help people who are falling to the bottom. And Vladimir Putin knows this. As I said, he's intelligent. And so he exploits that, not with an answer, but by undermining our faith as Western people in how our societies should function. So he is presenting a challenge that you could argue is almost a more disturbing challenge than during the Cold War. I mean, in the Cold War, it was what? The ideology, Marxism, Leninism versus capitalism. That seems so easy and clean compared to today. And it was. I think it was less dangerous, although we almost blew each other up. But we can still blow each other up because we have weapons right now, fewer of them, but they are on hair trigger alert, aimed at each other. And the new president, I keep saying to my friends who say, well, nukes, you know, isn't that all Cold War? No. The new president, whoever he or she will be, if there is some type of attack or new, indication that there is an attack, will have approximately 15 minutes to make up their minds how to respond. Because the missiles can be here in less than a half an hour. That is shocking when you think that. Just think about that. That's why they all get gray hair, I guarantee, because the gravity of these decisions. So Vladimir Putin, again, I don't like to say, oh, he's a threat, all of this kind of freighted terminology. Vladimir Putin is playing his hand the way he wants to play his hand. He's going to play it both for his country and for his own interest, his own power, staying in power, and the people who are in power with him. But it is going to be a challenge that we're not quite understanding, It's not good versus evil. It's much more complicated. And a lot of it is he is exploiting the very weaknesses that we have in our society that are only going to get worse. So I would argue that the best way to deal with Russia, we have to have a very sane and kind of rational approach, but we also have to look at the issues that are weaknesses in our society and begin to fix them. Because if we don't, it's going to be very easy for Putin or whoever, it could be, post-Putin could be worse. There is that theory in Moscow, well, you don't like Putin, we'll wait who's coming next, see who's coming next. That's possible. So whoever it's going to be over there could be a real challenge in ways we don't understand. So on that cheery note, I will leave you with, I think it was almost impressionistic what I was trying to tell you, but what I wanted, because I know you probably, the level of, I think, understanding of Russia is probably quite high in this room, so I didn't want to kind of go through something that was very predictable, but to bring you my impressions really hot off the press from being in Russia a lot and a lot recently. In fact, at the end of the month, just in 2.5 weeks or so, I go to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania security conference, and I'm going to be, kind of running around up there talking with people about their feelings of Russia and what's happening. So it's an area I'm very interested in, and I don't know whether I'll end up in Moscow this time, but I'm glad that we'll have an opportunity to discuss some of these issues. So thank you very much. Okay, so Marga.
Let me know if you can hear me. Great. Well, thank you very much for that. I mean, you've certainly given us a lot to think about. And it's a real pleasure for me to be here as one of your 28,000 followers on Facebook. More than that, in fact, I think 28,000 something. And I say that because those of you who are following Russia, it's a wonderful place to get the latest information, a great compendium of articles and thinking about what's going on. So thank you very much for that.
You're the perfect person to ask questions.
Well, first of all, I have to say that there are a lot of questions here. And generally in audiences, you have about 6 questions. So, you can quickly, just easily divide them up into the 6 questions. But there really are not very many overlapping questions here. So I don't know if you can see this whole sheath.
Okay, I'll talk fast.
We're either going to be here all night or the 2 questions actually that do seem to overlap have to do with the role of the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, and also Cuba. U.S. normalizing relations with Cuba, and also Russia, and Putin's call for perhaps putting base on Cuba, and how does that change the equation? But first, I wanted to take an opportunity to pick up and ask a question and pick up where you left off, which is if you were advising the next president, male or female, what would you tell that person in terms of how to relate to Russia?
Boy, it's so complex. But I would say, do not expect that you're going to reset the relationship. There's no resetting. There's no button that we're going to press. It's not going to be reset. Putin doesn't want it. I would also say you have to realize that he is going to analyze what we are doing very, very carefully, look at every weakness that we have. So we have to be very understanding that he is, I would say, less active than reactive. He analyzes what the US is doing, looks for weaknesses, waits for us to do something, and then comes in. It's kind of the judo way, of approaching it. And then also I'd say you can't make it into a little 9-year-old boy relationship in which you call Putin, as I hate to say President Obama said, the boy sulking in the back of the classroom comment. I mean, and forget about talking about a regional power. Forget about insulting them. It's not going to work. It just makes Putin mad, and it's really kind of juvenile. I think you have to treat him, I think you have to be strong, and this may be would be the danger right now. I think we could be too strong, too. But smartly strong, and just say there are certain things we do want to work where we can, but we want to have, I would say, an adult relationship with Russia, but very aware that Putin has a weak hand. He really does. Economically, he does, even militarily. I mean, I'm not a military expert, but I know that NATO would defeat Russia. However, it would be horrible. So you don't want these things to happen. I'd start with the most important. I would try to get more disarmament agreements, arms control agreements. I would try to have an extension of START, the new START treaty. And I would also try to have more trade, oddly enough. You know, if we had more, we were talking about this upstairs, if we had more practical relationship with Russia in which there's not a lot to buy right now from Russia, but there are ways they can buy stuff from us. They're buying things right now. But concentrate on a trade relationship that could improve things, really, truly. And I think citizen involvement could still have a good effect on the relationship, but cut out the name-calling, but be very aware that Putin tries to be unpredictable, because that's part of his strategy when you have a weak hand.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. So the two questions that I mentioned that have come up a number of times, the role of the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, in Putin's foreign policy, his domestic policy. Mm-hmm. How would you describe that?
You know, it's a very big and very important subject. I would say the Russian Orthodox Church, in contrast to many other churches, it's more like a kind of like the old-fashioned European church, state church. It's considered part of the national definition of what it means to be Russia. So it's very czarist in that sense. In fact, I have a friend who's Jewish, and she said she goes to church. And I said, why? And she said, well, I go to a liberal church. It's Russian Orthodox. But it just feels kind of like home, and it kind of defines me as a Russian. So, you know, that definition of yourself, you don't even have to be religious, but it is part of the definition of who you are as Russian. Putin is using that. He's using it in the society in terms of it's very conservative. The church that he supports tends to be socially very, very conservative. So the anti-LGBT movement, et cetera, is tied to the church, and it's a way of consolidating society. Putin's main objective, which is really important, all politics is local, all politics, a lot of Russia's policies can be explained if you look at what's he trying to do domestically. Find the external enemy, consolidate at home. His economy is not in good shape. Uh-oh, read the New York Times today. The budget is in bad shape. What do? Find an external enemy and hope that people forget that there are budget cuts coming. So the church, to get back to the church is part of that moral majority type approach that Putin uses to consolidate society. It is also part of what's called the Russian world. And the Russian world, Ruski Mir, is this diaspora of Russians who were left behind at the collapse of the Soviet Union in countries, Kazakhstan, the Baltics, some in Georgia, you know, all over the place. And Putin's theory, which is tied very much to the church, is that he has a responsibility, in fact, a duty to protect Russians wherever they are. Now, does that mean Brighton Beach, you know? Well, maybe, you know, like New Jersey, New York, maybe. But he really does use that as a justification for moving into areas a la Ukraine, to protect the rights of those Russians who are at risk.
Cuba. So there are a few questions here that are asking, now that the U.S. is normalizing relations, how does that play into sort of the broader geopolitical relationship with Russia.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because of the old days when Russia and Cuba were, so united, and we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, et cetera. Putin says, well, actually, I'm not too sure he said it, but at least the Kremlin said they are reconsidering putting bases back in Cuba and Vietnam. I mentioned that. I think that's bluster. I'm not convinced that they're going to do that. But they know that it drives Americans crazy. So anything, he says things sometimes, it's almost like, I'm not going to talk about this, but, so he'll raise these things, and then he said, but we don't want to have to go that far. Because after all, that would be destabilizing. But we could. But I'm not going to do that. So I think that's part of that mentality. But I think relations with Cuba, it's great that we have relations with them. I think it's very important in Latin America. And they're at our doorstep. So, but I don't think the Russians are coming back.
I know that you've written and studied a lot about soft diplomacy and soft power. So here's a question that asks how you see the confluence of conflict of soft and hard power in the 21st century, namely sanctions as soft power, conflict as hard power.
Well, sanctions are their own kind of subject, aren't they? Whether they work or not. They're certainly hurting the Russian economy, but the price of oil is hurting the Russian economy more than sanctions. But they are having an effect. And then Putin had anti-sanctions, in which he put sanctions on fruits and vegetables coming from Europe, et cetera. So I don't really want to get into that debate about whether sanctions work or not. But I'd say soft power is very, very important. Because right now, if you look, forget about nukes about to rain down on our heads. I don't think Putin doesn't want a war with the United States. That's insane. I don't even think that Putin wants to invade the Baltics, as some people said. Why? There's no payoff for him in the Baltics. But I think this ability to weaken alliances, to create dissension between Europe and the United States, to take advantage of the soft underbelly of liberal democracy, is really where Putin's doing things. And I think it's very, very dangerous precisely because people in the West are losing faith in their governments. And it doesn't mean, they're not going to look to Russia as an example. Russia has no solutions, but Russia can tear it apart. And that is an objective, to weaken. Now, it is trying to rebuild some of the economic structures. They have the Eurasian Economic Union and all of these things that they're creating to kind of knit together, especially economically, the old parts of the Soviet Union. But objectively, I don't think they're really successful at that. Where they are successful is in continuing political relationships where corruption rules. And it's a lot easier. This is playing out, by the way, not to diverge too much, but Ukraine, that initially was a big debate about joining Europe. It was an economic debate, and then it turned into an invasion. It was really economic. So maybe Marx was right. Everything is economic.
Moving to other parts of the globe, what is Russia's relationship with China, friend or foe? And there's a similar question that's based on Russia's relationship with Turkey. So, which has actually just in the course of this last year gone from friend to foe to friend.
Head spinning.
Yeah. And so how do you see Russia dealing with these countries, especially China, but also Turkey on its periphery?
Yeah. China, of course, is hugely important. I think the Russians absolutely know that China could eat their lunch. Their economy, the Russian economy, GDP, is below that of Spain right now. And look at China. So it's almost unfair. But when Western sanctions were imposed, Russia began turning to China as its friend. I remember I was in Moscow, and credit cards like MasterCard and Visa were no longer working for Russians, and they were saying, well, we're going to get Chinese credit cards. And having lived in Hong Kong, I thought, good luck. I would not want Chinese credit cards or Chinese banks. Thank you very much. But rhetorically, they are very much all about saying that China is on our side. You know, the BRICS, B-R-I-C-S, are united against the United States and will ultimately be stronger, et cetera. I think China looks at Russia as a relatively weak country, as a source of energy, and ultimately maybe it can sell things to Russia, but it sells much, much more to Europe and the United States. So we matter to the Chinese much more than Russia matters to China. And Russia is also worried about China in Central Asia, because you know, China has really moved into Central Asia and into Africa. Where are the Chinese not right now? So they talk a good game about China, but ultimately, I think the Chinese are long-term thinkers. And, you know, I always have this feeling that they're kind of patting the Russians on the head and saying, yeah, we're your friends, we're going to do deals. And they have done a few deals, but ultimately, they're no fools. You know? Turkey, crazy. Turkey used to be, I've been very involved because I've been in Russia at every stage of that insane relationship. You know, Turkey was the place where Russians went on vacation. It was a cheap vacation, beautiful country, you know, good food, et cetera. And all of the Russians went on vacation to Turkey. They loved Erdogan, they loved Turkey, et cetera. Then all of a sudden, Turkey shot down a Russian plane on the border of Syria. And all of a sudden, and I remember it was almost like you woke up and, oh my God, we hate Turkey. Turkey is a terrible country. President Erdogan is a monster. And the Russian media flipped, they just turned on a dime. Literally overnight, that Turkey always had been plotting against our back. And, you know, this goes on for, what, a year? And then all of a sudden now they're friendly again. All of a sudden they are friendly again, they're meeting. It's political. Some of it does, of course, have to do with Syria. It just shows that, you know, Putin will do things, but he is not always predictable because he will do what he thinks is useful at the given moment, which is, again, a lesson to us. I don't think I need to go into Turkey too much, but yeah.
That's fine. So here's a good question. What happens after Putin?
Ooh, what happens after Putin? You mean he's actually going to die? Do you think? I don't know.
Or leave the presidency?
Well, the next presidential election is 2018. So, but it's already underway. You can kind of see they're preparing for it. So 2018, then he has 6 years in office. He turned it from 4 years in office till 6 years. So I'm not very good at math, but 18 plus 6 is 24. So he came into power in 2000. So he will be in office, if he lives and everything continues the way we think, for a quarter century, which is really amazing. There is no big succession. The prime minister, you know, would take over. There physically is, you know, legally a succession, but there is really nobody that objectively is being groomed for that spot. And the opposition has been destroyed, and they're very good at destroying themselves too, in fighting and bickering, et cetera. So I think that's a really dangerous question, because if Putin leaves early, I think it's very unpredictable who would be next. So another factor that we have to think about.
Here's a softball question. What sparked your interest in Russia at such a young age?
You know, well, I think the language. I have a twin sister, and we were in the great metropolis of Scranton, Pennsylvania, in a public high school that had 4 years of Russian and German and Spanish, and it was a great school. And so we chose Russian, And I just fell in love with the language, and I was truly hooked. We had an amazingly dedicated teacher, and also my father was an FBI agent, career FBI agent. And I always had that feeling that, I was kind of know the enemy, that I was doing a service. This sounds so crazy now, but I kind of felt, kind of doing a service for my country by learning the enemy. In those days, they would say, optimists study Russian, pessimists study Chinese. But I do have to say, also at that time, when I was in going in, end of high school, beginning of college, the federal government was giving a lot of money, as you know, to studying in other countries, and Russia was getting a fair amount of that money. So we were able to get fellowships or scholarships to study in St. Petersburg, Leningrad, and it was the best money that the government ever spent, because so many people, no, I'm serious, there are so many people today who are in the State Department, who are ambassadors, who are people who really deal with Russia policy, who were beneficiaries of those programs, who went on exchanges and then went on exhibits by the old U.S. Information Agency, which I loved. I did too, exhibits throughout the Soviet Union. I just have to tell one quick story. My father was with the FBI for 30 years, and every 10 years they would get a little pin, a little gold pin, kind of like that you would hang on a chain. And when I went to Moscow—
Years in service, something like that?
10 years of service, exactly. And I had my father's 10-year pin. So when I went to Moscow, I took it with me. And right after 9/11, the KGB, FSB now, was very friendly and very helpful. And they used to invite us over to look at pictures of terrible terrorists, like in Chechnya. And we would do stories, and they were very welcoming. So this one time, I thought, I'm going to KGB headquarters. I'm going to take Vince's pin. And Vince, my father, was dead by that time. But I thought, Vinny, I'm going to take you with me in disguise. So I took this little pin, and we waited in the office of Andropov, who was the head and favorite of Putin. He really respected him. And there's his office, which is almost like a museum. And when they went out, and they said, okay, you wait here, and we saw it was very cool. I took out the pin, and I put it on Andropov's desk. And I just let it sit there for a second, and I thought, Vinny, I'll bet you never thought you'd end up here. It's just really crazy.
That's a wonderful story. Thank you. So many wonderful questions. There's a question here asking about the political will of the West to face or to stop future aggression, such as in Ukraine. And I just want to point out that I think you had rightly pointed out that I just came back from Georgia, where I was part of an observer group for the elections. And Russia played a role, obviously, in the elections. I mean, the country has lost 20% of its land now occupied to Russia, thanks to this terrible war that they had in 2008. But so, is there political will? Should there be political will to stop, further encroachment by Russia in these satellite or neighboring countries?
I think there definitely has to be. I mean, Crimea, granted, if you probably carried out a vote, a legal vote, not just a ginned-up referendum, but if you carried out a vote, although people at the time were not asking to be part of Russia, probably most people, I don't know, what do you think, Margot? I think probably most people would have, well, I think they might have agreed. There are a lot of people who felt that, Khrushchev gave Crimea to Russia, to Ukraine in, 1953, and they kind of felt that it was Russian. But the way you don't take over a place and send in little green men and lie about it. That's not the way you do things in Europe. And so I think we have to make it very clear that there can be no more of that. There really can't. You cannot lie and go in and send your troops in and subvert places. Now, there are some things that we're going to have to live with, because Crimea, I don't think, is ever going back to Ukraine. It's just not. Ukraine's too weak, and it's never going to happen. But there are other places where we have to make it very clear that you cannot do that. You cannot do it again. That is where you get into this delicate dance of putting troops into, on a rotating basis, permanent rotating basis, into many of the countries, the Baltics certainly, and in Central Europe. And, you know, it's a show of force to Putin. So, but I do think that we have to be very firm about that.
How about countries like Ukraine or Georgia that see themselves as part of the West and would like to join the EU and NATO, possibly? How should the West, whether it's the European Union, whether it's the US, deal again with these aspirations of the people versus, you know, Russia's views that this is an aggression against their
you know,
them.
it's so complicated because Georgia, for example, I mean, there are, you know, people in Georgia, people in quite a lot of Ukraine really legitimately want to be part of NATO and the EU. But those two countries in particular, I don't think are ready to be part of NATO because both of them have significant parts of their territory that are held by Russia. You know, Ukraine now has Crimea. The eastern part is really a conflict zone in a war. And then in Georgia, you have Abkhazia and South Ossetia held basically by Russia. So I don't think that they realistically can become part of NATO at this point. The only thing that bothers me, and having been in Georgia very recently, is that if you keep saying, don't worry, eventually you'll be with us, but you don't follow through with something, then people get very disenchanted with the West, and that's why you have this kind of these nascent political groups in Georgia that support Russia. So it's a balancing act, but I would say the best thing for Ukraine would be to help them economically and be very straight ahead with them, the need for reform, because if they were doing well, they would be the best example to Russia and to Russians of how democracy really can work. So I would say just support them as much as you can, let them, you know, have exercises with NATO, probably bring them in economically, but at this point, I think the situation is too unstable, and they won't, for quite a long time, I don't think they're ready to be in NATO.
Thank you. A recent August 2016 Chatham House briefing quoted Minister Counselor Alexander Kramarenko, Russia can now fight a conventional war in Europe and win. It will be up to the West to start with nuclear weapons. Do you believe this? Is this
rather? You know, every day, what they do is they allow some of these kind of old cold warriors to come out and make all sorts of bizarre threats. Number one, they can't win a conventional war in Europe. I hate to tell them. They can't. They are the people who are constantly talking about nuclear weapons. Not the United States. The United States is not reminding people that we are a nuclear power. It's the Russians who are doing that. And it's the Russians who are doing that because they know it freaks out the West. That is why they are doing it. But this is very dangerous. You know, you begin to talk about nuclear weapons, and then you begin to talk about tactical nuclear weapons, little tiny nuclear weapons that you could carry in a backpack. Then you start thinking, well, maybe you could use small nuclear weapons. And then we're doomed, really. So I think Russia's being very irresponsible, and this is where you ought to, I think the US, ignore these old guys. Just ignore them, because every day they're saying things like that.
There are also a number of questions, as you can imagine, on the US elections. You kind of answered in part some of them. But here's one that sort of looks at both Trump and Clinton, and how would you assess each of their abilities to deal with Putin?
Well, okay.
And there's a related question, which is, what does Putin really think of Trump?
All right. Putin is no fool. I think Putin, and Putin's job in East Germany was to verbavat, to recruit people. Recruit people. How do you recruit people? You tell them what they want to hear. You seduce them. You play to their fantasies, to their ego, to everything. So he's playing to Donald Trump's ego, But when I was in Moscow 2 months ago, I was asking people who were close to the Kremlin. I mean, nobody these days really knows everything, but people, think tank people and people who kind of know what's going on in the Kremlin. And what they said is, yes, they don't like Hillary, but they don't trust Trump either, because they see his, I don't think he has a policy, but his vacillation and his constant tacking back and forth. And nobody in the Kremlin, or a lot of people in the Kremlin, and there are some smart people there, really know how Trump would govern if he were president. So they're not putting their eggs in his basket and thinking that the relationship will be everything that he's talking about. So I think there's a lot of, concern and apprehension about what he would do. On Hillary, I mentioned it, they literally blame her for giving the sign for those demonstrators to come on the streets in 2011 and 2012. And Putin literally said, Hillary Clinton gave the sign to those demonstrators. So he really dislikes her, to put it mildly. But I think that they think she's, predictable, adult, rational. And so I think they can deal with it. No, I'm serious. I mean, that's the way they look at her. We hate her, but at least she's, like, normal. So we can deal with her. We can deal with her. And so but I think the problem with Hillary is she's going to have to, she is tough, but she also is going to have to be kind of a little more tough if she becomes president. And that could be, you could have Putin. Some people have said, what will he do? I think on the one hand, he could say, the bombing starts in 5 minutes, or he could say, you know what, elections are fraught with criticism and harsh words. I know that. I'm a politician. We have elections in my country too. And let's let bygones be bygones. Let's start with working together to fight terrorism. Let's have an alliance. As I told you a year ago, which he really did, anti-Hitler alliance, he said, just like Hitler, fighting Hitler, except that it's the terrorists. So he could play it both ways, or he could do something, I don't know, he could do a lot of things. But I think you could see a really, difficult Putin, or you could see the suddenly friendly Putin who wants to work together. And either way, it's going to be a challenge.
Can you discuss the role of the Arctic in the future of U.S.-Russian relations?
Oh, yes, great subject. I'm actually on a panel that's looking at that issue right now. Arctic, hugely important. I mean, people are beginning to talk about it. There's a lot of work being done on that subject. But I think I would say it's going to be very important because of the ice melting and new traffic patterns, new shipping lines, et cetera. It's going to be very important for global warming. It will be very important for a lot of different reasons. Hence, the Chinese are very interested in it. The Indians are everyone's interested in the Arctic. I am hoping that we can keep the relationship among the countries that are up there on more of a scientific basis. Right now, a lot of it is conducted kind of from a scientific basis. I am not hopeful that that's going to continue. But this is, to me, the Arctic, and maybe I'm naive, but I think the Arctic is one place where we might actually be able to start over with the Russians. Because it really is a place that we all are going to have to cooperate on. And the challenges of global warming will hit everyone. And so far, it's been conducted, although there's certainly a military security part to this, there's no question. But a lot of what's going on right now is scientific cooperation. And that is one area that we could really work with the Russians. We are now. So I'm hopeful. I think it's a hugely important subject.
Maybe likewise space?
Well, space we already do, yeah. And, you know, have for a number of years, so positive.
I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce the author, but Mikhail Zygar's book.
Oh, Zygar's
book, All the Kremlin's Men, claims an inner circle uses propaganda to influence Putin, and case in point is the invasion of Crimea. How do you feel about this book or its thesis?
I know him. I think he's a great journalist. I think he makes a really good point. Maybe not using the word propaganda, but they do feed him. His inner circle a lot of times feeds him what they think he wants to hear and what they would prefer that he does hear. And I've talked with US officials who really believe that Putin doesn't always know objectively what's going on. And that's very worrisome. He looks like he does. He looks like he's in command, but he doesn't trust a whole lot of people. And the people who are very close to him are a very small group of people. So I think Zygar makes a very good point that probably he's not exposed. I mean, he really does believe some of these theories about the United States. And I guess maybe Jill Stein, candidate for president of the United States, probably believes them too. But most, people, rational people, don't believe that we are out to destroy Russia and take its natural resources. We have enough problems. I mean, do we need to take over Russia? I would urge us not to do that. But Putin actually, there are a lot of people in the Kremlin who actually believe that.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
And it's kind of an interesting one. One would assume that the Russian people are much more unified than the American people. Does that somehow make our relations imbalanced?
That's an interesting question. Boy. Well, yeah. But ultimately, no. I mean, like right now, I would say yes. There is a lot of, the war fever that has united people, the feeling that America and the West are out to get them. So there is, among a lot of Russians, this feeling that they're pulling together. Not everybody, certainly, but there is a certain unity. But I would say it's a negative unity. It's based on the external enemy, and it's fragile because, as I mentioned, one of the real things that's happening is the economy is in very bad shape, or is in bad shape, let's call it. So beneath that support for Putin is really a lack of faith in their own government. And you see it on basic levels, corrupt police, corrupt officials. There's a lot of, right now, there are a lot of revelations about corruption in Russia. So, yeah, on the surface, they may look more united, but I don't think that they're really united, oddly enough, the way the American people, maybe for the next at least few weeks, I hope, will be united. I don't know what will happen after the election, but I do think that because our society is more flexible and open to change and open to immigrants and is able to pull together, think of it, just think of Minneapolis. Think of all of the people from different countries who don't kill each other on the streets of Minneapolis for the most part. This is amazing. No, I have been to countries where you look at people who are literally killing each other, and the United States, for the most part, we don't, come out with machetes on the streets to kill each other. Now, I'm not talking, I'm exaggerating, obviously, but I think there is more inner strength in the United States, ultimately. But I do worry. I think that this election has torn open some really jagged wounds in our society and has undermined our real faith in the strength that we have. You know, I travel a lot abroad, and I come back, and I've told people this over and over again, that Americans, when you go outside and you look at this outside, we're actually more similar than we are different. But when you're inside, we all look different, and we all look as if we're at each other's throats. But if we do this to ourselves, then we won't even have to worry about Russian propaganda. We won't even have to worry about Putin, because we will have done it to ourselves. So I am worried. Well, I'll leave it on that. I actually am worried.
Thank you.
Thank Jill Dougherty, thank you so much. And I'm going to be 2001 of your Facebook followers after listening to you tonight. This was just, you shed so many wonderful insights, and we're so pleased to have you in Minnesota. Also, she's so generous with her time. This afternoon, Jill Dougherty met with two classes, I think, over at Highland Park Senior High in St. Paul, and talk to them tomorrow morning. She's speaking at a breakfast for our corporate members, then at a lunch, going over to the Russian Museum of Art, then off to another lunch that we're hosting with a number of retired Foreign Service officers in town, and then a dinner tomorrow night. So you will meet many Minnesotans. We thank you for your insights. And Margot Squires, we're so lucky that you get to stay in Minnesota and continue to moderate. And I want to thank all of you so much for coming tonight to this Global Minnesota program. As you know, we do so much programming. We will bring the world to you. We hope to see you at many other programs. And if those of you who aren't members want to join tonight, take advantage of that incentive, please sign up at the desk. Thank you so much for coming.